So I am going to look at each of you, and if each of you feels comfortable and brave, I invite you to look at each other as well. It's really nice to see you all. This is where you say, it's nice to be seen. I keep trying, but okay. Eileen, I was thrilled to hear you mention that you had met Gloria Steinem. I couldn't bring her with me, so I brought her picture. This is the book that I'll be referring to during today's talk. I first heard about it on a program on C-SPAN about books, and I immediately said to my daughter, I would like a copy of that book for my birthday. And lo and behold, my God, Amazon delivered. I sat down and went through this book from start to finish, savoring it. It's written in a variety of styles. The first part is very much a personal memoir of her life as a child, growing up with two very different parents. And then it goes on into her years as a writer, as an activist, her experiences around the world with different kinds of women and men, working to bring about social change. If you are a fan of hers, I definitely recommend you read it. If you're not so much a fan, I recommend you explore it. There is, as it happens, a very interesting chapter in there about Hillary Clinton and about why women don't like Hillary Clinton. Not why men don't, why women don't. And I found it quite interesting given all the discussion going on right now. You are probably familiar with the saying that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Am I right? That was the quote I put on the invitation to my ordination service. And those of you who were at Lincroft yesterday saw the stained glass window in the Earth Room, which is made from a satellite photo from outer space. And that was the image on the invitation, and around it it said, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Now what about this saying that I heard recently in a meeting of Unitarian Universalists? If you want to travel fast, go alone. If you want to travel far, go together. That really made me think. It made me think a lot because I personally, although I love being in groups, and this is my social encounter usually of the week, in the rest of my life, I spend a lot of time alone. I write alone, I read alone, I live alone most of the time. And I'd never thought about the fact that my own travels around the world had been done in some tension between being alone and being with other people, in visiting other people and in staying by myself. And this is a big subject in this book, On the Road. Today's talk considers those truths as revealed by Gloria Steinem and by any of you who would like to share as we go along. I'm going to pose some questions, and if you'd like to share an experience that relates to them, please do. Most of us probably know her as a feminist writer and as a co-founder of Ms. Magazine. When you read My Life on the Road, her latest memoir, you discover how her rambling childhood on the road for most of each year shaped her future. She traveled with her father, who had wandering feet, who couldn't bear to stay in one place for more than 3 months, and he only did that in the summer because he had a resort in northern Michigan. So he would pack Gloria and her older sister and their mother into a car, and they would just drive back and forth and all around, north and south, throughout the United States, while he sold gemstones and antiques from the back of his car. He was a very gregarious man, huge man, weighed over 300 pounds according to her. Never did anything unless he had a car with him. Very jolly, much loved by people, a real raconteur, and he instilled in her a comfort with being on the road. Her mother, however, was not that kind of person. Her mother had been a reporter for a newspaper, had given that up when she had her first child, and never went back to it in later years. She was the person who represented home to Gloria. So she had the stay-at-home mom, even though the mom was in the car with them, and then she had the wandering father. And both of these figures, of course, became very important to how she interacted with the world. She was prompted to get out into the world by all that childhood wandering, first as an observer and then as a freelance writer. Over time, she covered the most important social changes and movements of her time, met with their founders and leaders, and became a movement organizer and spokesperson herself. Along the way, she was a member of New York Magazine's founding staff, a supporter and writer for Congresswoman Bella Abzug at the same time that I was working in Bella's office in New York City, and a position paper writer and strategic planner for women's conferences around the world, working with South Asian Indian, Native American Indian, and African American women of all ages. Deeply committed to social justice activism and women's rights and safety, hers is a deeply thoughtful voice and a very inspiring life. As she puts it, and she said this 2 or 3 years ago when I met with her in New Brunswick, violence in the world at large begins with violence in the home. How true, how sad, and how true. As for living in a democracy, she said this: voting is the least you can do to bring about change. It's the least you can do. If you don't even do that, you're not participating, are you? You're not acting. You are doing nothing about the status quo. I'd like to share with you many of her observations from her book. The first are about being on the road. One of the reasons Gloria, and I'm going to call her that because, well, that's how I understand her, as an informal kind of person, a friend with a serious mind and a sympathetic ear. Gloria wanted to share with us the less visible side of her life, not the one in front of a microphone or on a stage or in a film. She wanted to share the quieter side behind the scenes and the way it shaped her. And here she says, "When people ask me why I still have hope and energy after all these years, I always say, because I travel." I'm sure you all know that saying, travel broadens the mind. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes. For her, travel was the big education. Yes, she went to a fancy school. She went to Smith College and graduated Phi Beta Kappa. But it was her life on the road that informed her as a person, not those 4 years of college. For more than 4 decades, she writes, I have spent at least half of my time on the road. I always thought of my road life as temporary, assuming that one day I would grow up and settle down. Now I realize that the road was permanent and settling down was temporary. So here's my first question. Have any of you ever thought of yourselves as gypsies, wanderers, road warriors who didn't want to settle down? You did. Would you like to say something about it?
I'm still that way.
You're still that way. Good for you.
I'll settle up again. And I'm trying to take him with me.
Trying to create another gypsy wanderer. Yeah. Somebody else over here? Yes.
When I was young, my parents took us to Minnesota to camp.
Yeah.
And we never stayed for a month. And we never stayed in one campground. And as I got, and I loved that, and as we got older, I could drive. So my sister and I would get in the car and drive to different churches Sundays, because we
was Barb. She has an adventurous soul, yeah, and she used to go driving. Mhm. Did any of you find that when you got a driver's license, you took off? Isn't that often the gateway to freedom, especially for girls who in other ways are confined? Bicycle first. Yeah, bicycle. Bonnie?
Well, I couldn't ride a bike because we didn't have any. I had 6 or 7 brothers and sisters, and that they kept growing. And so I used to just go out in the woods, and I would just walk and walk and walk. And one time I got pretty thoroughly lost. And I had a dog. Thank God the dog got me out of there because it was hunting season and there were shotguns going off all over the place. But that's how I wandered, all over this area.
Yeah. Anyone else have a sharing? Kiki?
I think I wandered in my mind more than I did physically.
Uh-huh.
I had the gypsy spirit reading. I mean, I traveled, certainly, but I wandered in my mind more than physically.
Yeah, it's an excellent point because reading is, for most of us, a distraction from the place we're in. That's how it functions. C.S. Lewis said that we read to know that we are not alone. So we have company in the pages of the stories that we read, and we also have an escape hatch.
But it's not just a distraction from where we are. Reading is a real engagement. It's an engagement, with the other place and with another mind. I hear people talking all the time, e-books aren't real books and this kind of thing. But the thing is, the book exists only in its interaction between the words written on a screen or on the page and the mind of whoever happens to be reading them, at the time. That's where they exist. I found too, in terms of traveling, I used to travel a lot internationally when I was in my 20s and 30s. And I had a British friend whose wife could barely move beyond the village. She'd actually been raised in an orphanage, unfortunately, and had a lot of problems. But she said, how can you travel around and be so calm? And I really had no idea until I read something by Vanessa Williams, the tennis player. She had a lot of siblings, and she didn't have her own bed growing up. So she used to just sleep in the beds of her sisters. And she said, instead of making her feel awful, like so many people reacted in that way, it made her feel like she belonged anywhere. And I always felt that sort of way. It was always easy to blend in, wherever I was and with whoever I was camping out with at the time.
Ruth?
Yeah, every 2 weeks every summer, my family would get in the car and my father would just drive and drive and drive. I mean, we never slept in a hotel. Seldom slept in the campgrounds. I slept in graveyards, quarries, and sunsets, and wherever.
Could you hear that? What she was saying? No. Ruth was saying that for 2 weeks in the summer, her father would take them driving and out camping. They never stayed in motels. Sometimes they slept in a graveyard and quarry.
Just pull out outside, get the sleeping bag out.
That's called wild camping in Holland. Wild kampieren. Yeah. Linda, you want to say something?
When I was thinking, what was the earliest that I traveled? And when I was a little kid, I got my little companion. I must have been 5 or 6 years old, and we decided to go into town to buy candy. Now, I had no money. Town was about 1.5 miles away. And so we set off for town. We did end up in town, but by that time, the sun was setting. I hadn't told anyone that I was leaving, and my father very kindly came by in his car and picked us up and took us home. But I was strongly discouraged from ever traveling again. It took me a while to get past that.
Yes, Nancy.
Well, I did many trips with my children because we camped. We camped in all the state parks in New England. And once I got them launched, I took off. And my greatest adventure really was when I had a van and I took out all the seats except the driver's seat and I set it up as a camper. It wasn't a camper, but I had an army cot, I had storage, and I drove to Montana and then did wilderness camping in Montana. And that is one of the highlights of my life.
Yeah, nice. Very
Really.
nice.
Yeah.
Yes.
When I first got married, my husband was in the military, so we went from New Jersey to Tennessee to California to Florida and back to New Jersey. I was 16, he was 19, and it was the most wonderful time of our lives. We had no children. We waited 5 years before we had any, and I'll tell you, I would love to go back there again.
Well,
We can. I got one more to go to get rid of.
we didn't hear you say that.
Lee, what about the chicken?
Oh, we didn't have chickens then. Well, I could leave them to you, Barbara.
Another subject on which Gloria had a lot to say was the subject of public speaking. I'm wondering how many of you are intimidated by that, about having public speaking, about having to get up and stand here and say something or do it somewhere else. Nobody's intimidated. Oh, you are? Oh, okay. The first time I had to do that was after I was elected head of the student government at my high school. And my responsibility was to go out on a stage in a huge auditorium and stand on the stage, which was this much higher than the nearest chair down there, and read all the announcements of the day about what was coming and what the infractions had been and what decisions had been made and so on. And the first time I walked on the stage, I started feeling seasick, and I thought, I'm going to somersault right down into the ground. But I didn't. I didn't get over, however, being nervous in front of a crowd until after I went through student teaching when I was at Columbia University, and my supervisor came to see me in the high school in Manhattan where I was teaching. She sat through a lesson, and then she called me to the back of the room, and I said, yes. She said, Julie, you have to get out from behind the desk. You have to get out into the room and engage with the students. I had no idea that I was glued to the desk like this. And as it turned out, it was the most helpful advice I ever had in terms of getting over being afraid to be exposed on the other side. Gloria Steinem said that dancers and writers are difficult to teach to speak in public because both have chosen a profession in which they don't have to speak. And she was both, a writer and a dancer. Well, as feminism was exploding around the country, and she was becoming more and more outraged about what happened to women, she partnered with a woman who was a much braver person than she was, and together they traveled to campuses and community groups around the United States. That was how she, as she put it, discovered something I might never otherwise have learned. And this is what she learned. People in the same room understand and empathize with each other in a way that isn't possible on the page or screen. And she writes at length later in the book about the problem of depending on technology for communication. The internet is not enough for communication. Not communication that's going to bring about change. Neither is an iPhone or an iPad, any of that. You need to be in the presence of the other people. And in some respects, this is like the effect that theater has on you. Theater is a very different experience from a film. A film can be powerfully motivating and inspiring, but when you're with the performers in the room, and you know that they're breathing and feeling emotion as you are, you have a different kind of connection with them. And she felt this was very important to the work she did as a community organizer. Gradually, I became the last thing on earth I would ever have imagined. I became a public speaker and a gatherer of groups. And this brought an even bigger reward, which was public listening. You know, when you're typing and you're on the internet, you're not listening. You're reading, but you're not listening. It was listening that taught me there would be readers for a national feminist magazine, no matter what publishing experts said to me. Taking to the road, she went back to this, by which I mean letting the road take you, changed who I thought I was. The road is messy in the way that real life is messy. It leads us out of denial and into reality, out of theory and into practice, out of caution and into action, out of statistics and into stories. In short, out of our heads and into our hearts. It is a way of being fully alive in the present. And while she was talking about that, she got to the subject of the media and news in general, and she said, while I was on the road, I learned that the media are not reality. Reality is reality. That's a very important thought right now, given how we are coaxed by the media into certain emotions, certain reactions, certain opinions. If you turned off the televisions, we're not reading newspapers, listening to the radio, you would have a very different sense of what was going on around you right now, would you not? There's a lot of fear, in particular, generated through media reports, because if it bleeds, it leads. And I know what that means because I worked in the newspaper business for 15 years. Your stress level goes way down when you're not reacting to other people's interpretations. Now, another reason for this book, aside from sharing the other side of her life, was to encourage people to spend time on the road. By that, Steinem meant traveling, or even living for a few days where you are in an on-the-road state of mind. Not seeking out the familiar, but staying open to whatever comes along. It can begin, she says, the moment you leave your door. But of course, you have to leave your door, right? You have to open it and step out. She gives some examples of famous roamers, one of these being the Sufi poet Rumi and his caravan that left the Iranian-Afghan region and went west across into Turkey, where he died. And she talks about the Roma who began in India and moved west all the way into Europe. When I was in India, the gypsies, the Romani, were the lowest of the low in the pecking order. They were considered even beyond the outcasts. They were out of caste. They were utterly outside the system. And they lived in horrible little tents, way the hell out in the middle of nowhere, where they could keep to themselves and not be harassed and attacked by people on layers of the caste system. She also mentions the Aboriginals who go on walkabout. They go on walkabout to get out of the place they usually are, to open up their spirits to ancestors, myths, dream time, all of those things. But they have to get out to get to that. A third reason for writing the book was to be able to share stories of what had happened, and what she had learned, and who she met on the road. And she said this, "Our brains are organized by narrative and image. After I joined the ranks of traveling organizers, which really just means being an entrepreneur of social change," you can adopt that title, entrepreneur of social change, "I discovered the magic of people telling their own stories to groups of strangers." Now, you've all been in this situation, at least in a one-on-one, sitting on a train with a total stranger, on a plane with a total stranger, in a waiting room with a total stranger, and oh, the secrets that come out. The things you learn about people you might never see again. It's amazing, isn't it? People feel safe in encounters with strangers when they're sharing something they don't want to share with the known relations. It's as if attentive people create a magnetic force field for stories the tellers themselves didn't even know they had inside them. Also, one of the simplest paths to deep change is for the less powerful to speak as much as they listen, and for the more powerful to listen as much as they speak, as in the poem Counsels that I read before starting this. You may know the saying that we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Now here's a question for you. How often do you feel really heard? And the other side of that is, how often do you practice deep listening? Not commenting, not interpreting, not responding, simply listening to someone who is with you? I'm posing these questions rhetorically so that you can think about them. Perhaps, she says, because women are seen as good listeners, I find that a traveling woman, perhaps especially a traveling feminist, becomes a kind of celestial bartender.
Well, say that again, it's beautiful.
Perhaps because women are seen as good listeners, I find that a traveling woman, perhaps especially a traveling feminist, becomes a kind of celestial bartender.
There's a title we can claim.
Yes. If you don't have a goal in life, maybe you want to aspire to celestial bartending. People say things they wouldn't share with a therapist. Oh, and this is true. This is true, the things I have heard. As I became more recognizable as part of a movement that gives birth to hope in many people's lives, I became the recipient of even more stories, not just from women, also from men. Her last hope in writing the book is to open up the idea of the road literally, because, as she said, it's been overwhelmingly masculine turf. And I want you to think about that in relation to how many stories, books, films, plays, people who named do you know that belong to women who went out on the road as explorers, adventurers, and so on. Can you name more than 5?
No. 5.
Can you name 5?
Cheryl Strayed, she's one.
Carol Strayed, yes.
Cheryl
Strayed from Wild, yeah.
Wild. That's recent.
Yes, very recent. Barb?
Margaret Mead.
Margaret Mead, absolutely. Excellent.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Gloria.
Amelia Earhart, very good.
So she didn't really go out on her own, but she was married to G.P. Putnam.
But he didn't go with her when she was flying.
No.
Well, she always had a male navigator with her,
Yeah.
you know,
Jane
and
Goodall.
he funded her all the time. She was actually, well, as well known as she was, partly because of G.P. Putnam, who was a big publicist, and the fact that she looked like she could have been Lindbergh's sister. There were many, many women aviators who were much more independent and much better flyers than she. But she was in one of the first big publicity machines, actually.
How about the abolitionists like Sojourner Truth?
Sojourner Truth, outstanding choice, yes.
Especially Harriet Tubman, being the first woman to actually become direct combat troops. I think probably the only one so far in the United States.
Peace Pilgrim.
Peace Pilgrim. Can you say more about her?
I can't remember her real name, but she, in her 60s, I think, walked over thousands of miles in the name of peace, carrying nothing but a toothbrush and a comb, and depended on others for the benefit of lodging and food.
This would be a great topic to look into, do some background research about. For instance, there's a famous woman who crossed the Australian desert on a camel, and a film was made of her, which was only in release for this long, and I can't remember her name. National Geographic did a special issue about her. There have been hundreds of them, but we don't know about most of them. Their stories are not in history books by and large. Their journals are not published at the rate that men's journals are published. So this also tells you something about a social expectation around where women are going to be. More likely at home or in one place. Men out there in the greater world. Those great road trip novels like Jack Kerouac and On the Road. What about the differences between people who roam and those who stay at home? What, Gloria asks, is the balance between being at home and being on the road? Between living by the hearth and living out at the horizon? There are differences, and some people struggle between the two places. There are differences also concerning the immanent, what is in here, which is what the hearth represents, and the transcendent, which represents everything outer, everything outer. The evanescent, which is the shifting and the changing and the seemingly permanent, that which isn't going to change so much. She discovered the great irony in her father's on-the-roadness because it was his rebellion against an incredibly scheduled life lived by his parents, who were immigrants and had run away from an unsettled life. So they created stability, and then he ran away from that. And for her, it was the opposite. She enjoyed the insecurity, but at the same time, she longed for a home. And at one point, she said, I could have tattooed on my head, needs home, looking for a home. So, I'm sure that some of you have thought about this from time to time. She said she was quite mature, as in 30s and 40s, before she found an apartment that she considered her home base in New York City. Until then, she was coming and going. In my heart, I know that if I were forced into an either-or choice between constancy and change, home and the road, between being a Hazar, that is a dweller in houses, and an Arab, a dweller in tents, I too would choose the road. Now, one of the biggest discoveries she made while on the road, and this has been very important for every social justice initiative she's undertaken, is the idea of the talking circle. This was a discovery she made when she went to India after she graduated from Smith. She went there for 2 years, and she walked everywhere she went. She traveled alone. I did this too for a while in India, and she encountered the exact same questions from Indians that I did, 30 years later. Where is your husband, your father, your son? Where is your brother? What is the purpose of your visit to India? Why are you here? Why are you not at home? Do you have children? She was asked these questions over and over again. And it was a big adjustment for her because they were very personal questions. But she went into the villages and she sat and she listened to Indian women in villages sharing the stories of their lives and their concerns. Everyone sat, sort of in a semicircle. Everyone took turns speaking, just like in the poem. No one would speak more than twice. No one would speak less than once.
Can we invite the young people in?
They can come in.
They didn't want to bother us because
Because they did.
because their school is finished.
So when you think about talking circles, you may recognize them as the format in which Unitarian Universalist meetings often take place. People do check-in going around the room one by one. People try not to hog the floor. The Unitarian experience is largely a horizontal experience as opposed to a vertical, hierarchical experience. And she associates this very strongly with the way women tend to be in groups. When she was on a second trip to India in the early 70s, she went to interview a woman named Kamala Devi. And Kamala Devi, this may surprise you, it certainly surprised me, had this to say about women. We had the idea, now this is Gloria speaking, we had the idea of collecting Gandhian tactics into a pamphlet for women's movements everywhere. After all, Gandhi's tactic of nonviolent resistance would be well suited to women, and so would his massive marches and consumer boycotts. As part of our research, we interviewed Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, a rare woman leader during the independence struggle. She had worked with Gandhi, led his national women's organization, warned him against agreeing to the partition of India and Pakistan as the price of independence, and then led a renaissance of Indian handicrafts that used the talents of millions of refugees displaced by partition. As we explained our idea of teaching Gandhian tactics to women's movements, She listened to us patiently, sitting and rocking on her veranda, sipping tea. When we were finished, she said, "Well, of course, my dears, we taught him everything he knew." She made us laugh and she explained, in India, under the British, Gandhi had witnessed a massive women's movement organizing against sati. You remember sati? The immolation of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres, and much more. In England, as a young man studying to be a barrister, Gandhi also saw the English suffragist movement, and he later urged activists working for self-rule in India to emulate the courage and tactics of the Pankhursts, England's most famous and radical suffragists. After his return to India from South Africa, where he organized against the discrimination that Indians were subjected to, he was alarmed to find an independence movement with almost no roots in the villages and daily lives of ordinary people. He began to live like a villager himself, to organize mass marches and consumer boycotts, and to measure success by changes in the lives of the poorest and the least powerful, the village women. So, I had walked in Indian villages, sure that they had no relevance to my own life, but now a women's revolution was springing from talking circles of our own. At home, I had been going to everything from battered women's shelters and freestanding clinics to women's centers on campuses and protests by single mothers trying to survive on welfare. My becoming an itinerant feminist organizer was just a Western version of walking in villages. Isn't that amazing? It's amazing how the family, the human family, is so tied together by behaviors we're unaware of outside of our own, and how it took her leaving, going outside to see that in another place. So I found that really fascinating and very important. She said, I'm getting to the end here, all movements need a few people who can't be fired. When you are dependent, it's very hard not to be worried about people whose approval you depend on. Her father refused to ever have a boss, that's why he lived in his car, and so did she. As she put it, she suffered from an addiction to freedom and a love of community. This to me sounds very Unitarian. We're all about being independent, we're anti-authoritarian, and at the same time we try to build beloved communities in which we are interconnected. So we move from the dependence of children to the independence of young adults into middle age, and then we move to interdependence as we get wiser and more mature and understand that it's really important to relate to each other. If I had to name the most important discovery of my life, it would be the portable community of talking circles, groups that gather with all five senses and allow consciousness to change. They have taught me to talk as well as to listen. They also showed me that writing, which is so very solitary, is fine company for organizing, which is so very communal. It just took me a while to discover that both can happen wherever you are. So, I think we're running over. I'm going to close with a general comment. This is a dense book. It's a dense book that tells us that avoiding conflict usually ends up bringing it to our doorstep. That controversy is a great teacher, and we should not be afraid of it. That we learn the most from going to places that we are the least familiar with. For her, it was going to reservations in Indian country out west, going to India and walking where the Indian village women were, going to Gallaudet University for the Deaf in Washington, D.C., where she learned a whole other meaning of the word listening and another meaning for speaking. Going in person, she writes, is the way to plant seeds for change, working for whatever change you want to see in the world. And you know the quote from Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world. This memoir is full of stories about the fight for equality across ethnicities, colors, genders, abilities, and points of view. It is about giving voice to the voiceless. It is about speaking up. It is about the great importance of collaborative action. It is about listening. It is about deep, meaningful friendships. It is about leaders such as Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president once upon a time, Wilma Mankiller, the first woman elected chief of the Cherokee Nation, Florence Kennedy, a black activist, and many more. It is about people who put their hands to the task of bringing social justice into being. People like you. People like you. People like us. And it is about the transformation of a shy and insecure girl into a woman of the world who has inspired countless men and women with her fierce honesty and, yes, with her love. She has spoken and written truth to power. May it be so for each of us.